not peaceful, never that. It was the stillness of polished marble floors, of sealed windows that didn't let sound in or out, of a house that existed only for appearances. Almira Dawson had grown used to this silence. She wore it like a second skin, high heels clicking across the cold tile as she walked toward the wide window that showed all of Manhattan, but never gave her the feeling of being part of it. Her father's voice still echoed in her ears from the night before. If you're not married by Q2, the board will doubt your leadership. We're not just a brand, Almira. We are a family company. You need to look the part. Almira had blinked once, slowly, her jaw tense. So I'm not just expected to make profits, I have to stage a love story too. Harvey Dawson hadn't responded. He never did. His silence was the loudest demand. So here she was, less than 24 hours later, staring down a manila folder with a contract inside it. A marriage contract. Not built on vows or love, but on legal clauses, confidentiality agreements, and a dollar amount, $100,000. Across the long glass table sat a man who looked out of place, not because he was nervous, he wasn't, but because he didn't belong in this kind of room. Noel Hart was young, maybe 24, with deep eyes that seemed too tired for his age. His hair was short, but not styled. His shirt was clean but not tailored. He sat with his back straight, hands folded, like someone who had spent years learning how not to take up space. "This isn't a joke to you?" Almira asked, watching him. Noel didn't smile. "If you're asking if I'll treat it seriously, I will. I followed your terms. You said you wanted someone discreet, unmarried, with no legal ties. I've got nothing. No debts, no assets, no family to get in the way." He said it so plainly, like reciting a list. But Almira caught it, that tiny pause before no family. The kind of pause that suggested he hadn't always had nothing. She opened the folder and placed a pen on top of the contract. 1 year, appear at all public events, pretend to be my husband. You'll live in the penthouse. You'll attend family functions. You will not touch me. This is not a real marriage, Mr. Hart. This is business. Noel picked up the pen, understood. He signed. She signed. And just like that, Almira Dawson was married. The press had a field day. "Dawson heiress weds mysterious young man," screamed one tabloid. Another headlined, "From nowhere to husband, who is Noel Hart?" Almira didn't flinch. She let the photographers swarm them at the faux engagement party, let her father shake Noel's hand stiffly while whispering something Almira didn't hear. Noel stood by her side the entire time, saying little, smiling when expected. He was a blank canvas, perfect for a woman who couldn't risk any surprises. But on the night of their wedding, a private ceremony at the city courthouse, followed by a staged champagne toast at the penthouse, Almira noticed something odd. Noel didn't celebrate. He didn't drink. He didn't even look at her with curiosity. Instead, after the guests left and the door clicked shut behind the last photographer, he simply sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, his assigned space, and stared at the floor. Almira stood in the doorway, her dress still on, heels in her hand. She was ready to mock the ridiculousness of it all, maybe throw in a joke about how they should at least enjoy the luxury they'd both signed into. But then he whispered something, so soft, she almost didn't catch it. "I've worn a ring before." She froze. Noel looked up. His eyes weren't cold. They weren't anything, really. Just tired, as if the day had drained whatever he had left. "I'm not asking questions," Almira said quickly, sharper than she meant. She didn't want stories. She wanted silence. That's what this deal was for, to buy her freedom in disguise. Noel nodded. "Right, of course." He stood, buttoned the top of his shirt, and walked past her. "Good night, Mrs. Dawson." It should have ended there. But Almira couldn't sleep. She lay awake in the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faintest creaks of movement from the guest room across the hall. This wasn't supposed to feel real. It wasn't supposed to feel at all. She turned over, closed her eyes, and whispered to herself, "It's only business. Just business." But in the back of her mind, she already knew Noel Hart wasn't just a name on a contract, and something about him, something she couldn't yet name, was going to ruin the quiet, predictable world she'd built for herself. Forever. Golden lights, golden roses, golden gowns swirling beneath crystal chandeliers. Cameras flashed like lightning across the marble floor, capturing every movement of the bride and groom as they stood on the small stage, smiling like royalty. Almira's white dress was fitted perfectly, her hair pulled into a sleek chignon. She looked flawless, untouched by the stress of the last few weeks. Her smile was measured, trained, polite. Her father stood beside her, beaming with pride that wasn't love but possession. Noel stood at her side in a tailored suit the stylist had forced on him, his hair cut slightly shorter, his shoes polished until they shined under the lights. He looked the part, but he wasn't smiling. The crowd didn't notice. They were too busy admiring the aesthetic, how clean and well-branded everything was. The Dawson legacy now extended to a modern love story, the powerful CEO daughter and the quiet, mysterious husband no one could place. It was romantic because it left space for imagination. The truth would ruin the picture. Noel kept his hand in Almira's, even when her fingers were stiff and cold. He didn't say much. Neither did she. They were perfect strangers under one spotlight. When it was time to cut the cake, Almira lifted the knife, placed Noel's hand over hers, and made the cut as cameras clicked. She leaned into his shoulder like the photographers wanted, whispered, "Smile for 5 seconds," and then stepped back. He did. Then the toast came, and her father's booming voice declared how proud he was, how this union was proof that the Dawson legacy would live on through strong partnership, dedication, and family values. Almira almost laughed. By midnight, the guests began to leave, still buzzing about how glamorous it had all been. Lucille, her best friend and lawyer, stayed back for a moment longer, fixing her gaze on Noel. "He barely talks," she said in a low voice. "You sure you know what you brought into your life?" Almira blinked at her. "That's the point, Lucille. I don't want anyone who talks. You don't want a partner. You want a mannequin." Almira said nothing. Lucille left with a sigh. The penthouse was quiet when they returned. Their chauffeur unloaded the gifts, while Almira went straight to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of wine. She hadn't eaten. She never ate at events. Her stomach had been twisted in a knot since morning, though she'd perfected the art of looking relaxed. Noel stood by the living room window, still wearing his suit, his tie slightly loosened. He didn't ask if she wanted help. He didn't comment on the night. He just stood there, staring at the city lights. "You can take the guest room," Almira finally said, keeping her voice neutral. "Fresh clothes are in the closet. Tomorrow morning we'll discuss your appearance schedule." He nodded, still not speaking. She turned to leave but paused when she heard the smallest sound behind her, a breath, then another. She looked back. Noel's hands were shaking, his head was bowed, and without warning, tears fell from his eyes, slow, silent, steady. Not dramatic, not loud, but real. Something inside her chest shifted. She hadn't expected this. Not tonight, not ever. "What is this?" she asked, not harshly, but like someone speaking from a safe distance. Regret? Guilt? Or did you just realize the price of $100,000 is higher than you thought? Noel didn't lift his head. "I didn't think it would feel like this," he said finally, voice low, almost broken. "It's just a contract, but it felt like I buried someone." Almira stepped closer, her glass forgotten in her hand. "Who?" He wiped his face quickly with the back of his hand, embarrassed. "I don't know. Maybe myself." They stood there for a moment, two people with nothing binding them except a document and a lie dressed in a white dress and a black suit. Almira had no training for this. She knew how to dominate boardrooms, how to silence a room with a glance, how to force investors to bend without ever raising her voice. But she didn't know what to do with a man crying quietly in her living room on the night of their wedding. She walked to the hallway, paused again, and looked back once more. "I don't care what happened before," she said without facing him. "Just don't let it ruin the deal. We play the part. We keep the world fooled. That's all." He didn't respond. She went to her bedroom, locked the door, and changed into silk pajamas that cost more than most people's rent. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, her back stiff against the pillow. But the tears wouldn't leave her mind. Something about them didn't feel fake. Something about them scared her. And as she stared at the ceiling, she whispered to herself, "This wasn't supposed to be this complicated." But she already knew. She wasn't the only one hiding. And maybe, just maybe, she hadn't hired a stranger. She had invited a ghost. The days after the wedding passed like snapshots. Public smiles, silent car rides, flashbulbs, stiff hand-holding, brief interviews. Almira Dawson, heiress of the Dawson Group, now had a husband. The board was pleased. Her father had stopped lecturing. The media played the story on loop, painting her as elegant and enigmatic, and him as the quiet romantic who had stolen her heart. But inside the penthouse, they lived like two ghosts haunting the same house. They barely spoke. Noel was polite, clean, silent. He woke early, disappeared into the gym, came back, read old books, and spent hours sketching in a notebook he never left on the table. Almira didn't ask what he was drawing. She didn't want to know. At least that's what she told herself. Until one night, the lie she told herself stopped working. It was nearly midnight. Almira had returned home late after a meeting with overseas partners. The lights were low. She didn't expect Noel to still be awake, but as she passed the living room, she saw him, shirtless, facing the window, the city lights casting faint shadows across his back. She froze, not because of his posture or the way he sat on the floor like a boy who had lost something, but because of the scars, jagged, pale, one newer than the others. She didn't mean to speak, but the words slipped out before she could stop herself. "What happened to your back?" Noel turned slightly, just enough to know he'd heard her. She waited. He didn't look at her. He didn't reach for his shirt. He only said, "Some truths hurt more than lies." The sentence was soft, but it settled into her chest like a weight. She stepped closer, slowly unsure of what she was doing. "I'm not asking to pry," she said, her voice lower. "But you live in my house. You wear my name. If there's something—" "There's nothing you can fix," he interrupted, not coldly, just factually. She stood in the quiet, watching him. The scar down his spine looked like it had been made by something sharp, deliberate, not an accident. She wanted to walk away. That would have been easier. That was always easier. But her feet didn't move. Instead, she asked, "Was it from before or after we made the deal?" He turned his head then, only slightly, and she saw his face in the dim light. Not angry, not ashamed, just resigned. "Does it matter?" Almira didn't answer. She turned away and walked to her room. But she didn't sleep. She lay in bed, her thoughts refusing to settle. She had built her life on control. Controlled deals, controlled language, controlled emotions. Even this marriage was a decision made for efficiency, not affection. But for the first time, she realized she didn't know what she had brought into her life. Noel Hart was supposed to be a shadow, a silhouette, a stand-in. But he wasn't. He had pain stitched into his skin, and that pain spoke louder than anything he had ever said. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He made her coffee, black and strong, just how she liked it. She nodded, took the cup, and didn't mention the night before. But she watched him differently now. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on certain things. The sound of children laughing on TV, the news segment on a foster care scandal, a charity commercial showing shelters. His fingers always clenched for half a second, like muscle memory. And she started to wonder, who had hurt him? Why had he agreed to this marriage, really? Was it only about money? Or was he running from something or someone? Almira found herself opening his sketchbook one day while he was in the shower. She didn't mean to. It had fallen behind the couch, and instinct led her to flip through it. Page after page, faces, eyes. Some of the faces looked familiar, hers, her father, Lucille, but most were women, crying, smiling, broken. One page near the end was different, a drawing of a young boy hiding behind a door, his hands over his ears, a shadow of a large man looming behind him. She closed the book instantly, her hands shaking slightly. That night, she waited in the kitchen longer than usual. When Noel returned from wherever he'd gone, she handed him a cup of tea. He took it, surprised. They sat in silence for a while. Then she said without looking at him, "You know, contracts don't cover everything. There are parts of people you don't see on paper." Noel stared at his cup. "I wasn't expecting to see that part of you," she added softly. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I wasn't expecting anyone to look." He stood after a moment, nodded once, and walked away. But something had changed. For the first time, the distance between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door, and maybe, just maybe, one of them had left it unlocked. The weeks passed like carefully stacked pages in a calendar. Events, meetings, dinners, all perfectly planned and precisely executed. Almira had always known how to play the part of a CEO, and now she was learning how to play the part of a wife. Noel, to her surprise, had become even more convincing in his role. At public functions, he was impeccable. He opened doors for her. He smiled just enough. He placed his hand gently on the small of her back in photographs, always aware of where the camera was. Investors found him charming. Her father, Harvey, begrudgingly approved. Even Lucille, who had doubted everything about the arrangement, admitted he's good at this. Noel never crossed boundaries, never asked personal questions. He never touched Almira in private, not even accidentally. But when her wrist once twisted slightly while lifting her laptop case, he noticed, and without saying anything, he'd taken it from her hands and carried it to her office. He was protective but silent, present but removed. Inside the penthouse, they passed each other like actors backstage, professionally polite, never close enough to stumble. But the line between performance and reality began to blur the night the rain fell so hard it drowned out the city noise. Almira returned home from a late strategy meeting, her heels soaked, her coat dripping onto the floor. She was tired, emotionally frayed, and cold to her bones. She didn't expect anything from the night except silence and a hot shower. But the smell hit her as soon as she stepped into the hallway. It wasn't just food, it was memory. A soft spice, a faint trace of ginger and lemongrass, the distant comfort of something she hadn't tasted in over a decade. Her mother's favorite dish, lemongrass chicken with jasmine rice and tomato broth, was on the dining table, still warm, carefully plated. There were no candles, no music, just the food, and the man standing at the counter drying his hands with a kitchen towel. She stared at him. Noel turned, his expression unreadable. "Where did you learn this?" she asked slowly. He paused, wiped his fingers, and met her eyes. "You talk in your sleep." Almira's heart skipped. "What?" "You mentioned the smell, the taste, the way she made it only on Sundays. The tomato broth had to simmer for hours, and you always sat by the stove waiting for her to let you taste it first." Her chest tightened. She hadn't spoken about her mother in years, not even to Lucille, not to anyone. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop," Noel said quietly, "but I couldn't unhear it." Almira stepped forward cautiously. She sat at the table. The steam from the dish curled toward her like a breath from the past. She picked up a spoon, tasted the broth, and froze. It was almost identical, slightly imperfect, but deeply familiar, like someone had reached into her memories and served them on a plate. For a moment, the room felt too full, not with people, but with things left unsaid. "How long have I been talking in my sleep?" she asked, her voice thinner than usual. "Since the wedding night." "And you've just been listening?" He hesitated. "Not intentionally, just when I walked past your room." She stared at the bowl. She should have been angry, should have scolded him for crossing an unspoken boundary. But instead, she felt something far more dangerous, seen. Noel wasn't supposed to see her. He wasn't supposed to know her. She looked up, her gaze steady. "Why would you even bother cooking this? It's not part of the contract." His jaw clenched slightly. "Some things aren't about contracts. Almira pushed the plate away gently. She couldn't eat another bite, not because it wasn't good, but because it was too much, too close. Noel didn't argue. He picked up her plate and quietly began washing the dishes. She watched him, wondering who this man really was. He had become the perfect husband on the outside, a quiet guardian of her public image. But this was different. This wasn't calculated. This was knowing. Knowing the shape of her loss, the taste of her memories. That night, she didn't go straight to bed. She lingered in the hallway, listening to the faint sound of water running from the kitchen. She wanted to say something, thank you maybe, or ask something about him, his past, the truth he always sidestepped. But her feet stayed planted, and all she managed to say, in the softest voice, was, she used to sing while she cooked. Noel turned off the tap. She must have loved you very much, he said without turning. Almira stared at his back. She did, she whispered, and then she was gone. Noel nodded slowly. Then he walked past her without another word, heading to his room. Almira remained there, still tasting the broth on her tongue, still feeling something in her chest shift, dangerously close to breaking open. The man she thought she hired was vanishing, and someone else, someone more complex, more bruised, more real, was standing in his place. The weeks passed like carefully stacked pages in a calendar. Events, meetings, dinners, all perfectly planned and precisely executed. Almira had always known how to play the part of a CEO, and now she was learning how to play the part of a wife. Noel, to her surprise, had become even more convincing in his role. At public functions, he was impeccable. He opened doors for her. He smiled just enough. He placed his hand gently on the small of her back in photographs, always aware of where the camera was. Investors found him charming. Her father, Harvey, begrudgingly approved. Even Lucille, who had doubted everything about the arrangement, admitted he's good at this. Noel never crossed boundaries, never asked personal questions. He never touched Almira in private, not even accidentally. But when her wrist once twisted slightly while lifting her laptop case, he noticed. And without saying anything, he'd taken it from her hands and carried it to her office. He was protective but silent, present but removed. Inside the penthouse, they passed each other like actors backstage, professionally polite, never close enough to stumble. But the line between performance and reality began to blur the night the rain fell so hard it drowned out the city noise. Almira returned home from a late strategy meeting, her heels soaked, her coat dripping onto the floor. She was tired, emotionally frayed, and cold to her bones. She didn't expect anything from the night except silence and a hot shower. But the smell hit her as soon as she stepped into the hallway. It wasn't just food. It was memory. A soft spice, a faint trace of ginger and lemongrass, the distant comfort of something she hadn't tasted in over a decade. Her mother's favorite dish, lemongrass chicken with jasmine rice and tomato broth, was on the dining table, still warm, carefully plated. There were no candles, no music, just the food, and the man standing at the counter, drying his hands with a kitchen towel. She stared at him. Noel turned, his expression unreadable. "Where did you learn this?" she asked slowly. He paused, wiped his fingers, and met her eyes. "You talk in your sleep." Almira's heart skipped. "What?" "You mentioned the smell, the taste, the way she made it only on Sundays. The tomato broth had to simmer for hours, and you always sat by the stove, waiting for her to let you taste it first." Her chest tightened. She hadn't spoken about her mother in years. Not even to Lucille, not to anyone. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop," Noel said quietly, "but I couldn't unhear it." Almira stepped forward cautiously. She sat at the table. The steam from the dish curled toward her like a breath from the past. She picked up a spoon, tasted the broth, and froze. It was almost identical, slightly imperfect but deeply familiar, like someone had reached into her memories and served them on a plate. For a moment, the room felt too full, not with people but with things left unsaid. "How long have I been talking in my sleep?" she asked, her voice thinner than usual. "Since the wedding night. And you've just been listening. He hesitated, not intentionally, just when I walked past your room. She stared at the bowl. She should have been angry, should have scolded him for crossing an unspoken boundary. But instead, she felt something far more dangerous. Seen. Noel wasn't supposed to see her. He wasn't supposed to know her. She looked up, her gaze steady. Why would you even bother cooking this? It's not part of the contract. His jaw clenched slightly. Some things aren't about contracts. Almira pushed the plate away gently. She couldn't eat another bite. Not because it wasn't good, but because it was too much. Too close. Noel didn't argue. He picked up her plate and quietly began washing the dishes. She watched him, wondering who this man really was. He had become the perfect husband on the outside, a quiet guardian of her public image. But this was different. This wasn't calculated. This was knowing. Knowing the shape of her loss, the taste of her memories. That night, she didn't go straight to bed. She lingered in the hallway, listening to the faint sound of water running from the kitchen. She wanted to say something, thank you maybe, or ask something about him, his past, the truth he always sidestepped. But her feet stayed planted, and all she managed to say in the softest voice was, "She used to sing while she cooked." Noel turned off the tap. "She must have loved you very much," he said without turning. Almira stared at his back. "She did," she whispered, and then she was gone. Noel nodded, slowly. Then he walked past her without another word, heading to his room. Almira remained there, still tasting the broth on her tongue, still feeling something in her chest shift, dangerously close to breaking open. The man she thought she hired was vanishing, and someone else, someone more complex, more bruised, more real, was standing in his place. The illusion of control had always comforted Almira. Everything in her life, from her career to her relationships, existed inside clean lines, predictable outcomes, measurable results. Even her marriage, fake as it was, had been carefully built to avoid chaos. But control was a fragile thing, and the cracks had started to show. It was Lucille who found them first. She came to Almira's office late in the afternoon, files tucked under her arm, her expression unreadable. Almira looked up from her laptop and frowned. "You usually text." "This needed a face," Lucille said, pulling up a chair. Almira raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Lucille slid the manila folder across the desk. "I ran a deeper background check on your husband." Almira's spine stiffened. "I didn't ask you to." "No, you didn't. But I'm your lawyer and your friend, and something about him felt off." Almira didn't open the folder. She tapped her fingers on the table instead, jaw clenched. "You think you can find something about him I didn't already consider before signing the contract?" Lucille sighed, then leaned forward. "Almira, listen. He gave you one name, one school history, one ID, but that same ID pops up in 3 states, Texas, Michigan, and Connecticut, all with different addresses, different part-time jobs, and different records. It's like he never stayed anywhere long enough to plant roots." Almira stared at the closed folder. Maybe he moved a lot. Maybe he was running from poverty, or from pain. "Or from something worse," Lucille said softly. "You're living with a man who's erased most of his past. Doesn't that worry you?" Almira pushed the folder away without opening it. "What worries me is how comfortable you are doing this behind my back." Lucille stood up, frustration flashing in her eyes. "I just want you to be safe." But Almira had already turned back to her laptop. That night, she expected to find Noel in his usual spot near the window, sketching or reading. But he wasn't there. The bedroom door was open. His shoes were gone. His phone was left behind. No note, no message, just absence. At first, Almira didn't react. She assumed he went for a walk. He did that sometimes, quietly disappearing for an hour, coming back without comment. But when midnight passed and his room remained empty, she started to pace. She waited until morning. Still nothing. By the next night, a quiet unease had settled over the penthouse like fog. She called Lucille, trying not to sound anxious. "He's not home." Lucille's voice was steady. "Call the hospitals or the police." "I can't do that," Almira whispered. "We're married on paper, not in truth." Lucille didn't say anything. Almira didn't sleep that night. She stared at the guest room door still ajar, the sheets perfectly folded, the pillow untouched. By the second day, she found herself doing something she never thought she would. She opened the manila folder Lucille had left. The inconsistencies were clear. Dates that didn't match, jobs that ended suddenly, addresses that no longer existed. It wasn't just a man with a troubled past. It was a man who had made a habit of disappearing. She sat on the floor of her office, the folders spread out around her, trying to put together pieces of someone who had never given her more than fragments. It wasn't just the lies. It was the realization that she didn't even know which part of him had ever been real. By the end of the second night, she was angry. Angry at herself for defending him. Angry at Lucille for being right. Angry at Noel for vanishing like a shadow she'd only just begun to see clearly. Then, at 3:27 a.m., the elevator beeped. The door slid open. Noel stepped inside, drenched in rain, his hoodie pulled low over his forehead. His shoes were muddy, and he carried nothing with him. Almira was already standing in the living room, arms crossed, heart pounding. "Where the hell have you been?" she asked, the words harsher than she meant. Noel didn't flinch. He took off his wet jacket and placed it neatly on the coat rack. "I needed air." 48 hours of air? Her voice cracked. "No message, no call, no damn clue where you were?" He looked at her then. Really looked. "I didn't think I owed you that. You live in my house." "I live in your lie," he snapped back. "Don't confuse the two." Silence fell between them, sharp and violent. She stepped closer. "You lied to me first, Noel. Your background is a maze of ghosts. Who are you really?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally drained, like a man who'd been fighting himself for far too long. "Does it matter?" He said quietly. "You didn't hire me for my truth. You hired me for my silence." Almira stared at him, something inside her breaking open. Because he was right. She hadn't wanted a real man. She'd wanted a blank page. And now that he was showing her the messy, jagged handwriting of his past, she was terrified to read it. Noel turned to leave, but before he stepped into his room, he looked over his shoulder and said, "Next time you want to know something about me, ask. Don't send your best friend to dig graves." Then he closed the door behind him, and Almira stood alone, finally realizing this wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a story unraveling, and she didn't know how it would end. The rain had stopped, but Almira's thoughts hadn't. Days after Noel's return, the silence between them had thickened. Not hostile, but fragile, like a truce made from glass. They passed each other quietly in the mornings, traded stiff glances at dinner. She didn't ask where he had gone, and he didn't offer to tell. But the questions haunted her. One morning, while sorting laundry that Noel had left in the shared hamper, she found something wedged deep in the pocket of his old jacket. A folded receipt from a gas station in Vermont, dated only 2 days before his disappearance. On the back, scribbled in pencil, was a 7-digit property number and the name Hartley Road. Her breath caught. Hartley. It wasn't the name Hart that struck her. It was the familiarity of the scrawl. The way the Y curved backward. Something about it told her this place wasn't random. And if Noel wouldn't tell her what he was hiding, maybe the place would. She left at dawn the next day. 6 hours of driving brought her into the green-tinged silence of rural Vermont. The air was different here. Still, slow, thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Her GPS stopped working 5 miles before the property line. She had to follow hand-painted road signs on wooden stakes and old tire marks in the mud. The cabin sat alone near the edge of a forest. 2 windows, paint peeling, roof sagging slightly under years of neglect. It wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't alive either. It was holding its breath. Almira stepped out of the car, gravel crunching beneath her boots. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of old dust, pine wood, and something else, like dried flowers left too long in a vase. The furniture was minimal. A faded couch, a low wooden table, a bookshelf with no books, just candles and a single music box. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor as she wandered toward the back room. That's when she saw them. Drawings, children's drawings, taped neatly on the wall. Crayon sketches of a boy and a woman holding hands under a sun with too many rays. A dog, a house, a forest. One drawing was different. It was all red. Just red scribbles, harsh and angry, and in the corner, a small figure curled under a bed. The name Noel was written in shaky print at the bottom. Almira's breath hitched. She turned to the shelf beside the window. Old photographs were lined up in dusty frames. A woman with tired eyes and dark hair, Noel as a boy, maybe 6 or 7, standing beside her. She looked thin. Her smile was quiet, not joyful, just barely there. And beneath one frame, folded like a forgotten letter, was a document. She opened it slowly. Certificate of death. Name, Eleanor Hart. Date of death, March 4, 2006. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Location, Hartley Road Residence, Vermont. Her fingers trembled. She sat down, the floor cold beneath her. Eleanor Hart, his mother, she died here. Not in an accident, not in a hospital, in this house. Almira felt the weight of it. The drawings, the silence, the faded dishes in the kitchen. A child had lived here, had watched something terrible happen, had kept these memories in ink and paper and tucked them into corners he never intended anyone to see. She closed her eyes, a sudden wave of nausea rising in her throat. This wasn't just a hideaway. It was a graveyard of secrets, a museum of pain that Noel had carried in pieces ever since he walked into her life. And yet, he'd never spoken of it, never even whispered its name. She stood and looked around again, this time with softer eyes. The couch, too small for comfort. The walls, too thin for screaming. The music box on the shelf, maybe once hers. Maybe once played to drown out the things a boy shouldn't have heard. Almira stepped outside and stood on the porch, the forest humming quietly around her. She didn't know how long she stood there. She didn't call Noel. She didn't text. Because for the first time, she realized he wasn't trying to deceive her. He was trying to survive her world without exposing his. She had hired a stranger for protection, but he was the one still protecting a child who no longer existed. A child who once lived here and never left. The sun was low, sinking behind the thick curtain of trees as Almira sat on the porch steps of the Vermont cabin, arms wrapped around herself. The air was crisp, brushing against her skin like breath on a wound. Hours had passed since she found the drawings and the death certificate. Her mind spun, but she didn't cry. She couldn't. Her body held still in that way it did when emotions threatened to overflow, tight, rigid, protective. She didn't know how long she waited, but when she heard the low hum of an approaching car, her heart skipped. Gravel cracked under tires as a black sedan pulled into the clearing. She stood slowly, watching as the car rolled to a stop. The engine died. The door opened. Noel stepped out. His eyes locked with hers. His face was paler than usual, clothes wrinkled, hair slightly damp from a recent shower. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then his shoulders dropped, and he took one hesitant step forward. "You weren't supposed to come here," he said softly. "You weren't supposed to disappear," she replied. He looked past her at the cabin, at the trees behind it, at everything but her face. His jaw tightened. "I saw the death certificate," she said. "Your mother." Noel closed his eyes. "I saw the drawings, too." He walked slowly toward the porch but didn't climb the steps. He stayed there, like a boy afraid of getting too close to the thing he once lost. "She died in that house, didn't she?" Almira asked. He nodded. "I thought she fell. I told myself that for years," he said, voice hoarse. "But she didn't. He hit her. He hit her and left her there to bleed while I hid under the bed and listened." Almira felt the air punch out of her lungs. "He was a businessman," Noel continued. "Successful, rich. Everyone loved him. But at home he was something else. He used to call her weak, said she made him small, that she ruined him. He broke her down piece by piece until there was nothing left." He finally looked up at Almira. I was 7 when she died. They put me in foster care. I ran away 3 times before I was 12. Changed my name. Made up stories. Every time someone got too close, I vanished again. That's why there are holes in my record. I stopped being a real person a long time ago. Almira gripped the railing of the porch, steadying herself. So when you saw my ad, she said, her voice quieter, you thought, what, that pretending to be someone's husband would be easier than being yourself? I thought disappearing into someone else's life might be safer than living in my own. His words hung between them, thick and heavy. But then you, he continued, you weren't like the women I remembered. You didn't try to own me. You didn't even want me. At least not in the beginning. You wanted silence. So I gave you that. Almira swallowed. But it wasn't silence, was it? You listened. You made my mother's dish. You stayed up when I talked in my sleep. You protected me when I didn't ask. I didn't know how not to, he said, his voice breaking. You reminded me of her. Not in pain, but in the way you hid yours. In the way you carried yourself like you didn't need anyone. That kind of strength, it's lonely. I know it because I lived with it. He stepped up the first stair, then stopped again. I didn't mean to fall into this, into you. I just wanted 1 year of quiet, 1 year without running. But you kept seeing me, and that terrified me more than anything. Almira looked at him, really looked at him. The man she'd hired was no longer a stranger. He was a scarred boy in the body of a man, trying to outrun a past he never chose, holding together all the shattered pieces no one else could see. And she was no longer just a businesswoman hiding behind deals and power suits. She was a daughter who still missed her mother's song. A woman who had learned how to survive, but not how to be touched. They stood there in the gathering dark, 2 broken people who had collided by chance and ended up in a place neither of them expected. Almira took a step forward. Noel didn't flinch. She placed a hand gently over his, not as a wife, not as a boss, but as someone who finally understood the silence they both shared. You don't have to run anymore, she whispered. He looked at her, eyes glassy. Neither do you. And for the first time, they didn't need a contract. They needed each other. The return to Manhattan felt different this time. Almira no longer walked with the same practiced posture she had perfected for boardrooms and press conferences. Something had softened. Something had settled. The armor was still there, but it no longer clanged when she moved. And Noel? He stayed close, but not too close. Just enough that his presence reminded her she wasn't carrying everything alone anymore. They didn't speak about what happened in Vermont. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was full. But peace, as always, is temporary when power is watching. 3 days after their return, Harvey Dawson stormed into her office without knocking. His eyes were sharp, his lips a thin line of rage. He dropped a folder onto her desk, the kind she recognized instantly, the kind filled with betrayal. I hope this is a joke, he said. Almira didn't flinch. She opened the folder and saw it, the marriage contract, a copy. Somehow, someone had leaked it. Every clause, every signature, every dollar amount she paid Noel, every lie carefully signed and notarized. How long have you known? She asked calmly. Does it matter? He hissed. Do you realize what this will do to our name? You turned our family into a circus. The board is already demanding a meeting. They want blood. I'll give them truth, Almira said. That's more than they're used to. Harvey stared at her like she'd lost her mind. You've been living with a fraud. You married a ghost. A man with no real name, no traceable past. Did you honestly believe this wouldn't explode in your face? No, she said softly. I just stopped caring if it did. He took a deep breath, stepped back from her desk, and said the one thing he knew would break her. You're no longer part of Dawson Corp. Effective immediately. I've already pushed it through the board. Almira looked down, then up again. You mean you've taken back what was mine? Harvey's voice dropped. No, I've rescued what you almost destroyed. He left without waiting for a response. The next few days blurred. Headlines flooded the internet. Fake marriage scandal hits Dawson Empire. Heiress pays for husband, then pays the price. The media had a feast. Paparazzi crowded outside her apartment. Calls from former clients dried up. Her name, once a symbol of power, was now a punchline. Noel disappeared from the penthouse one evening without a word. At first, she thought he'd just gone out for a walk again. But then hours passed. Then a full day. On the second night, she found him sitting on the rooftop of a nearby building, hoodie pulled over his head, hands wrapped around a cup of cheap coffee. "I can't let you lose everything for me," he said before she could speak. "You didn't cost me anything," she replied, walking toward him. "I was supposed to disappear before this got too real." She sat beside him. The wind cut through the air, but she didn't shiver. "You were never the lie, Noel," she said quietly. "My silence was." He turned his head, uncertain. "I stayed silent when my father used my mother's death to control me. I stayed silent when the board asked about my personal life, like it was a line item on a spreadsheet. I stayed silent because I thought love was weakness." Noel looked at her, eyes searching. "But it's not," she said. "It's cost me everything, but it's the only thing I've ever had that was actually mine." They sat in stillness, Manhattan glittering beneath them. She reached for his hand. This time, he didn't hesitate. "I don't want to be a man who ruins your life," he said. "You didn't ruin it," she whispered. "You helped me finally live it." He breathed in slowly, deeply. For the first time in a long time, he looked like someone who might believe he deserved to stay. Downstairs, her phone buzzed endlessly with missed calls and demands, but she didn't answer. Up here on this quiet rooftop, with nothing left but the man who had once only been a transaction, Almira finally felt free. She had no company, no title, no legacy to maintain, but she had a hand in hers that didn't ask for anything. And that, she realized, was more real than anything she'd ever built. Even love that starts in fiction can become the most honest thing we ever know. The cabin in Vermont looked almost the same as it did a year ago. Weathered wood, ivy curling along the sides, and a creaky porch swing that never stopped groaning. But inside, everything had changed. The silence that once filled the house like an accusation now breathed gently between two people who no longer feared each other's ghosts. Almira moved through the small kitchen barefoot, hair tied in a loose braid, wearing an old flannel shirt Noel had outgrown. The smell of coffee filled the room, rich and familiar. The same two mugs sat side by side on the table, chipped but beloved, just like the couple who used them every morning. Outside, the leaves had just begun to change. Autumn was slower in Vermont, as if the trees knew how to let go more gently than people ever could. Noel was on the porch, sketchbook balanced on his knee, pencil tapping against the side of his lip. He was drawing a little boy with two big eyes and paint-smeared fingers, a student from the art therapy group he led twice a week at the community center in town. Most of the kids came from foster homes. A few came from nothing at all. Almira stepped onto the porch and handed him his coffee. He took it without looking up, his pencil still moving. "You're getting better at hands," she said, peering at the page. "I should be," he replied. "I draw them enough." She sat beside him on the swing, pulling a blanket over both their legs. They swayed gently, the quiet creaking a lullaby. Her phone vibrated on the table behind them. She didn't reach for it. She hadn't in months. No more press releases. No more meetings. No more statements to prepare. "I got another letter from the foundation yesterday," she said. "They want to expand the grief program into New Hampshire." He nodded. "Are you going to say yes?" "I think so," she said, watching a red leaf float lazily to the ground. "It's not just about grief anymore. It's about giving people a place where their pain doesn't have to perform." Noel smiled at that. "Sounds familiar." She turned to him, studied his profile, the soft curve of his jaw, the faint lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled now, the steady rhythm of someone who no longer flinched at quiet. "Can I ask you something?" she said, always. If we were to do it again, she began, get married. But for real, no contracts, no cameras, no expectations. Would you want that? He put down his pencil. I'd only want that, he said. They didn't need a ceremony. They didn't need permission. They needed a moment. Almira disappeared inside and returned with a torn page from an old journal and 2 pencils. She handed one to him. Write with me. Noah looked at the paper. Blank. Fragile. A space to build something honest. He began first. I vow to never hide again. Not my past, not my fear, not my love. Then he handed it to her. She wrote slowly. I vow to speak, even when silence feels easier. I vow to see you, even when you pull away. I vow to remember that love isn't earned through perfection, but given through presence. They looked at the words. No signatures, no witnesses. Just pencil. Soft, erasable. Real. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it between the pages of his sketchbook. They kissed, not out of ceremony, but instinct. And when she pulled back, Almira whispered, the first night shocked me, because it was the first time silence felt safe. Noel rested his forehead against hers. It still is. The porch swing rocked. The sun broke through the trees. No titles, no headlines. Just 2 people who had written their vows late, but exactly when they were ready.